Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming here today to our latest Con Home panel, this time entitled How Can Rail Be Supported to Boost Growth and Deliver Benefits Across the UK, which we're very pleased to be doing in partnership with HS1 this afternoon. My name is William Atkinson. I'm the Assistant Editor of Conservative Home. Transport is pivotal to connecting the people and places that deliver growth. It is central to every objective, really, that the government has, from increasing growth to levelling up. But the rail industry has a key role to play in this, for obvious reasons. But we also have, if I dare say it, very significant issues coming down the track, from industrial action and changing consumer behaviour, with, I believe, usage on the railways down 20 to 25% since the pandemic. This event will specifically look at solutions to help the sector recover and deliver wider benefits to the UK economy. And I am very pleased today to be joined by Diane Perry, who is the CEO of HS1, and I believe the first female managing director of a major railway company. So it's a pleasure to have your 30-odd years of experience with us here on the panel today. I'm also pleased to be joined by Hugh Merriman, who is the Minister for Rail, and next to me is Jack Brereton, the Vice Chair of the Rail All-Party Parliamentary Group. And the format for today will involve me hopefully shutting up at some point, and we will have 3-minute opening speeches from each of our panellists, and then I will ask a series of questions and then pass things open to the audience. So without further ado, Diane, would you like to kick us off?
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to kick off by being really positive, because I think we are living in exciting times. We've got a fantastic network. If I look at HS1, it's a fairly new asset. It performs really well, but only 50% of it is utilised. So from my perspective as a CEO, really sweating that asset is a key thing. And one of the aspects, I think, of UK Rail is we have an asset, so let's use it. Now, post-pandemic, we've seen a reduction certainly in kind of commuter travel, but leisure has come back phenomenally. And one of the challenges the sector has to address and face into is what's our future customer model? And how do we change our operating model to support those customers? And the industry is doing a lot already. So GBR, in terms of rail reform, one of the exciting initiatives that they're looking at is fares, ticketing and retail. And I'm not going to talk about closure of ticket offices or anything like that. What I'm going to talk about is moving fares and ticketing into a more simplified format, something that customers trust and understand. And we all know that today's ticketing is far too complicated, and people don't trust the system. They trust TfL, they trust the Oyster card, and that's almost the vision that GBR Rail has got for the rest of the network. And it's got exciting plans. 80% of all ticketing to be done by pay-as-you-go. And it needs to get there, and it needs to get there quickly. And I think that's quite exciting. What else am I positive about? Well, again, if I look at HS1, we're a unique blend of public-private ownership. I've got a very long concession that takes me out to 2040. That allows me to think longer term, plan longer term. There's not many other kind of companies in UK Rail that can say that, and that's got to be the model for moving forwards. Private sector involvement is fundamental to the future of UK Rail. Look at all the growth that we've had, since the mid-90s. A lot of that has come about because of private investment, and it needs to continue, and that will help the railways grow. Now, in terms of HS1, we're pretty unique. There's not a model like ours anywhere else. And we've got exciting growth plans. We talk about growth in HS1. We don't talk about pausing. We talk about driving international travel. We talk about more destinations on the departure board at St Pancras. And we've got exciting plans. And that's exciting for the HS1 system because we've had a tough 2 or 3 years in the pandemic, and we've survived. No government support. We wouldn't have expected it. But we've survived. And now we want to grow, and now we want to continue to drive the economy for the UK and wider on into Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Hugh?
Thank you very much, William, for having me, to you and the Conservative Home team, and Diane, always a pleasure, and Jack as well. I was here last year, I think, and I was then chair of the Transport Select Committee, so I was able to shoot my mouth off in a manner that I'm not quite as permitted to do, but I'll give it a go anyway. But the subject is a fascinating one. Just to pick up some of the points that Diane has mentioned, this, in a way, we're talking about HS1, and it should be the model of how we look at delivering our new railways, built by the private sector, funded by the private sector, and then it's for the private sector to then effectively lease off with track access charges to the private sector to be able to then deliver the services, albeit with one exception with South Eastern. And in my view, it's a good example of if you allow the private sector to get on and use its own capital, take the risk, get the reward, then you end up with more services. And it's something that we would really dearly like to see. There have been challenges, and again, Jack and I were involved in that through the Select Committee during COVID, where Eurostar wrote to us and explained that they had had to cease some of their services. They stopped operating at Ashford and Ebbsfleet, and they had seen a drop-off of numbers that they could handle from 2,200 passengers per hour to 1,500. And the concern we have at the moment is, whilst we see growth, if their model effectively is to sort of constrain the sort of supply and actually sweat the asset through the passengers, then that means that there's a great opportunity to use the HS1 rail network to bring in competitors. We know the Swiss would like to find a way of travelling through from Basel to Geneva through to London, and we also know that there are other operators who are in discussions right now to see if they can actually set up. Now, it's very difficult to do because you're dealing both with the regulatory, the language, the system from the French side and the UK side, and of course Eurostar has part ownership all the way through to the French state as well, so there might be a particular challenge. But we would dearly like to see more competition on that line. It's a good example of open access working really well, and it would just be ideal for us, for the passengers, and obviously for HS1 as well. Coming down the horizon, or over the horizon, though, is the issue for the exit entry system, which is being proposed by the European Commission, has been proposed for some time, keeps getting put back. Looks like it will be put back further till after the Olympics have been held in Paris. And the challenge for that, as I saw when I was down with Getlink, who run Eurotunnel, where they're having to build a sort of vast new centre, it means that everyone will actually have to get out of a bus, car, lorry, in order to get their biometrics tested in the way that works at an airport but doesn't work effectively at a port. And there could be huge challenges there. And at the moment, we don't quite know what the rules would be. And of course, we don't have as much influence to change, but we are working with partners that do have that influence. It will be as problematic at the French border as it will be for ours. So that's one talking point that we should reference. I should also just sort of touch on Great British Railways that Diane mentions. Ultimately, for us, it's trying to simplify the way our railways are operated, trying to integrate track and train, to look at reform across ticketing and fares and make it a much simpler exercise. You touched on pay-as-you-go, Diane. We're rolling out another 53 of those stations. We use TfL's technology because they actually do it well. We've also got pilots that are being set up for the West Midlands and here in Manchester so that it gets rolled out across. Because we know where you've got a simplified system, then you get trust and then people just go through and you don't need as much of a sort of resource-intensive business to be able to deliver it. So, like you, Diane, I'm hugely optimistic about what rail can do. It transforms lives. When we actually look at connecting our towns and our cities together, then rail is a great enabler for that type of growth and to really give people opportunities in the economy to skill up and make a better fist of their lives and their careers. So we should never lose sight of what the railway has done in the past, but it does need to change to do more of that in the future.
Thank you very much. And finally, Jack.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Con Home for inviting me to this panel and for putting on these sessions today. I think I got the advantage, obviously, of coming last, and very much do like and share the positivity that we've heard from the other two panellists. I think it is very much, there is a positivity, but we do have challenges. The positivity is that we've actually seen a return to rail quite considerably, particularly when it comes to leisure travel. Obviously, business travel isn't back to where it should be, but in terms of actually the return to rail, we have seen that actually the numbers of people who are now travelling on rail is still historically high. We're not quite back to pre-pandemic levels, but if you look at current numbers and compare them to times before 2010, actually this is quite a historically high amount of people who are choosing to travel by rail. So I think it's something like 80% of what it was on pre-pandemic levels in 2022, 2023. But revenues still remain below, and that is because of obviously business travel has not got back to where it needs to be. Revenues still remain at about 70% of what they were pre-pandemic. So we still need to do more. And I think what is most important is that rail becomes flexible to the changes that need to happen to encourage more use onto the railways, and particularly to support the growing use of rail for that leisure travel, for people who are travelling more occasionally to go about the country, to go on holiday. That is what we need to see in terms of encouraging more people to use rail. I think there are challenges. I think there are lots of challenges out there, and particularly we've obviously heard a minute ago about rail reform. I think this is one of the biggest issues that we need to face, and I have been a little bit sceptical about GBR and some of the potential for that, because I think there are a number of flavours of GBR, and what I think is important is that we don't just transfer over some of the problems that we've seen in the past, some of the behaviours within organisations like Network Rail. If they were to just transfer over to GBR, I think it would be very concerning. And so what I would like to see is that we have a GBR that is more like touch, that isn't so much like the old British Rail days. We need to have a GBR that actually encourages investment into the rail sector. Particularly what I would like to see is encouraging more private investment, because at the moment it is far too difficult for private investors coming into the UK to invest in rail. There's so much competition out there internationally, other countries which are more open, that are more supportive, that will encourage in that private investment in Europe, in countries like Japan, Canada. We were talking about this earlier in the week, the opportunities there for rail. We need to make it much more easier to attract in that private investment, to deliver the improvements and enhancements that we need to see, and ensure that we can support the rail sector to grow, to continue to support both in terms of passengers but also freight. And I think there are some huge potential opportunities when it comes to freight to really better connect up the country and obviously deliver on some of those wider issues around decarbonisation and attracting more of that freight onto rail to help with our net zero targets. So I think rail has a really important role to play in the future, and I hope that we will continue to see some of the improvements that we need to see.
Thank you very much, Jack. Apologies for the weather, ladies and gentlemen, but fortunately we're shielded from it and the benefits of having a marquee. So a question I would like to ask all of the panellists really to kick off is that you've all touched upon the importance of growth in the railways, and it is obviously something that we all have an interest in seeing. But if I could ask each of you in turn, what do you think is the single largest impediment to growth on the railways, and what should we do? What should we be doing about it in particular? So Diane, if I can ask you to go first.
Thank you. I mean, I touched upon it in my opening words, and basically it's fares and ticketing. And what can we do about it? Well, simplify it and gain trust from customers and passengers across the network that they are getting the lowest fare on their journeys. That will improve accessibility and certainly kind of confidence, around that. So from my perspective, that's the single biggest thing that we need to do.
Very good. And would you agree with that, Hugh?
Well, I certainly agree it's an area we need to reform, but I won't pick one, if you don't mind, in terms of the highest priority, because actually I think there is a whole number of priorities, and it looks like I've only got one objective. I'll just pick one out that is a real passion for me, and Jack touched on it, it's freight. We always talk about trains as if it's the passenger that matters only, whereas in fact a lot of people don't use the trains, therefore wonder why a £32 billion taxpayer subsidy for 2 years, what was that doing for them? And I firmly believe that rail actually delivers for everyone in the country, but it certainly delivers everyone's freight. but the challenge is it doesn't deliver enough of it. And I want to see more rail freight expanding, which actually means we need to give more confidence to those freight operators to be able to switch from HGV to freight. It's also our decarbonisation argument. So an average freight train will take 129 HGV movements off the roads. So that's good for freeing up congestion, and it's also good for the environment. But there have been real challenges, and that's why you only see at the ports about 15% of everything that comes in moved by freight. Now, if you look at the Port of Southampton, they've come up with a really good idea for a one-year period of trial. They will effectively charge more if you move cargo by road, but you can get all of that back if you move it by rail instead. And the aim there is to actually grow the share. What we have to do is open up the network more, so freight providers feel confident that their goods will get there in a just-in-time environment. And so further up from Southampton and Oxford, there's about £130 million being invested by the taxpayer, and part of that is to open up 12 new freight paths per day to enable freight to actually get around much better. There's an impact in terms of international freight. Love to see it more, and a challenge that's been given to me from a recent meeting is obviously our gauge is different compared to Europe, but actually with just some modifications to parts of our asset, you could actually get some of those freight trains through. As is often can be the case, the sort of barriers just seem insurmountable, to Jack's point about it's difficult to break through. So I need to work with Network Rail to challenge some of their assumptions as to why those projects can't get done, and then we will get more freight, not just domestically, but internationally as well. So I hope you don't mind me majoring on freight, but I think too often we forget about freight when we talk about trains.
Very good. And Jack, would you agree with that?
Well, I agree with the points that have been made. I don't think it is necessarily so simple as a one word answer. But I think my view is that we need to actually address some of the challenges that we've seen built up since the pandemic, particularly the fact that all risk and reward now sits with the government. I think that is a major barrier. There's no incentive at all now, really, for operators to attract more passengers, to attract more people onto our railways. We need to actually restore some of those incentives and encourage, operators to do things that will help to attract more people on and encourage more people onto our railways, because that is how we're going to see things improve, see more competition, which will help to drive down costs on our railways.
Very good. But I mean, of course, coming at it from the lens of competition seems like a naturally conservative way of doing it. But I think one striking feature of UK railways against international comparisons is the fact that, say, unlike in Germany or Spain, we don't subsidise rail travel to any great extent. If our ambition is to try and get more people using trains, do you see a case for subsidising rail fares, trying to lower prices for consumers?
Well, we do subsidise dramatically rail services in this country, and particularly since the pandemic, we have seen an increasing amount of government investment going into the rail industry to try and maintain the status quo, because obviously we haven't had the numbers, certainly during those particular years during the pandemic. So there has been an increased subsidisation of the rail sector, which isn't sustainable. And we need to attract more people back onto the railways if we are going to continue to see them succeed and continue to grow the sector. So I wouldn't agree with you that there is a huge amount of public money that's currently going into the rail sector.
Fair enough. Diane, did you have thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, certainly. We talk about revenue and growth, but it's got to be sustainable growth. And for the sustainable growth, the industry has got to do its bit as well. So I'll use the horrible word called productivity. And the rail sector isn't great at productivity. And I make no excuses, or apologies for saying that. We're not. And if you look at what drives productivity, strong leadership, streamlined processes, good training, a long-term view of things. And quite often in the rail sector, we're very short-term and we go boom and bust. That doesn't drive productivity. So as an industry, we've got to take a long, hard look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, how do we drive those productivity measures through? Now, all too often we use, it's the terms and conditions that go back to 1952. That's an easy excuse. And sometimes, it is a barrier. But there's plenty of examples across the industry where real productivity has been achieved. and we have technology coming through. You know, there's many, many ways where productivity can be realised, and the industry has got to commit to it.
Well, you used the word sustainable there, actually, Diane, and one other thing I would like to sort of touch upon is how successful has HS1, perhaps the rail industry, more broadly, been in working towards net zero and our broader environmental objectives?
Okay, we set our sustainability plan, 2021 I think it was, or 2020 even, just at the start of the pandemic. And we set ourselves an audacious goal. We wanted to be carbon neutral by 2030. So we were giving ourselves, you know, a stretch target. And that was really to align into COP21. We were the first infrastructure manager to move across to 100% renewable energy. We've had to change that because of the significant increases in costs. That hasn't changed our long-term vision. We have a five-prong plan based on the UN principles. So that's basically look at your energy usage, reduce your energy usage, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. We published our first formal ESG report this year, where we showed the progress that we've made, and we've made quite a lot of good progress, actually. So we're doing our bit. It's a huge topic. It's the right thing to be doing across the industry. I think I've got colleagues from RSSB here today who have, you know, led the industry on putting a sustainability plan in place. You know, and there's some good plans. We just need to implement them. You know, maybe I'll throw at Hugh.
Yeah. So
diesel trains. I don't
Yeah, do you want me to catch the diesel train?
Well, how important is, you know, the rail sector to achieving decarbonisation?
It's hugely important. We'll say it's a real opportunity for us as well, because you know, the younger patronage in terms of our market, actually they want to travel in a way that is decarbonised, so they're doing their bit as well. And also we're seeing falling numbers in terms of younger people who are taking their driving test. So that suggests to us that we've got a great new market there, which is why I'm so optimistic about the future for rail. And the plan we have is to fully decarbonise in terms of net zero by 2050 for the railways, but also by 2040 to take all diesels off the railway line. And that's where, again, we've got to do things differently. So I've sort of made this point before. When I wasn't a minister, I'll make it again. Now I am. So in my constituency, we have diesels sort of belching through the constituency, despite the fact that all of my constituency is electrified line because it's what's called third rail. We have a small section of railway that's just near Hastings that is actually not third rail. So to me, you just add third rail in. But third rail has been sort of banned because it's dangerous, yet we actually have it. So in my view, we actually need to start making trade-offs. Safety, obviously, is important, but decarbonising is important. And if you can end up taking all the diesels off that line by adding a small stretch of third line, then we should do that. And that's something that I will actually push you know, our safety regulators to weigh those balances up. And again, you know, electrification is really important. We've got about sort of 70% of the sort of customer usage that's electrified, but it's only about a third of all the railway lines itself. So there's still an awful long way to go. Question electrification, the costs. I'm certainly questioning it because I think we could do an awful lot more if we could do it cheaper. The Germans can do it about 20% the price we can, so we need to learn from international comparisons. Doing more of it drives the cost down, so that's absolutely a fair point. But also we look at other technologies, so battery power, and I think it's interesting, a trial that's been done recently in Liverpool into North Wales went a lot further than people had thought. And as I see someone from Siemens nodding, there's an awful lot of other train manufacturers are available, but there's an awful lot of technology going into those who've actually left diesel behind and are only interested in decarbonised power. Again, I shouldn't get too involved in manufacturers' PR, but there we are.
Very good. Jack.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the rolling stock points because I do think, you know, we obviously have seen considerable investment in rolling stock, but I do think that we need to see much more going into, and we need to have more certainty around those longer term pipelines, because actually when it comes to rolling stock, you know, we haven't had any new rolling stock announcements I think for over 3 years now, which is a challenge. We need to smooth out some of the peaks and troughs that we see. We need to have a more consistent programme of renewals, of building more rolling stock in this country. And I think particularly, Hugh mentions obviously the line that's close to him. I think, we've got a number of parts of the network where we could now be running bimodal trains. Cross-country is another example where, over half of that those services run on electrified track. So we could be using bimodal trains on those parts of the track, on other parts of the network, if we have that investment going in and focusing on where we need to in terms of that long-term plan for rolling stock.
Very good, thank you. And so coming to a question that I think is linked to HS1's particular nature, how important, Diane, and I can imagine your response to this might be as effusive as your opening speech was, but how important do you see international rail travel being in the wider context of the future of UK's railways?
It's phenomenally important on a number of fronts. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing 3.5% year-on-year growth on our international corridors. And what we've seen post-pandemic is that hockey stick recovery, where people have come back in their droves onto Eurostar. And that really is despite sort of some of the barriers that we've experienced, post-Brexit, additional kind of checks, more difficulty processing people through terminals. And Eurostar have been able to respond to that really, really positively and increase the throughput. Indeed, we had 19,500 people go through one day last week, which is pre-pandemic levels. So you adapt and you learn. The importance of international travel to the wider economy, pre-pandemic, £1 billion in tourism, £500 million a year is socio-economic benefit. And if you look at the decarbonisation agenda, 66,000 flights a year out of the air, 750,000 tonnes of carbon. Our strategy was to double that by 2030. We wanted to achieve modal shift. We wanted to sort of double the socio-economic impact. So, just some stats there in terms of how important international travel is to this economy. But, don't listen to me, listen to our customers. Listen to the people that want to travel on the trains. We did a survey recently. 84% said they would be more inclined to travel on high-speed rail if the opportunity was there rather than fly. We need to give people the choices. We need to enable those choices, and introduce and expand the network. We are connected to thousands of kilometres of high-speed rail. It's called Europe. We just got to go through a little waterway or under a little waterway to get there. We need to exploit it.
Very good. And Hugh, your thoughts?
No, I agree. Diane's absolutely right. I'll just actually widen it slightly because what's extraordinary about the Channel Tunnel is that it doesn't just take people and freight, it also takes power now. It's quite extraordinary. A new connection has been made that runs all the way along through the tunnel, alongside the trains, and actually delivers power between France and the UK. And you probably think, oh, that's all there to bring in the French nuclear power. In fact, the last year, we actually delivered the bulk of it from our renewables. And therefore made quite a bit of money out of the process as well. So it's already actually paying itself back. So that just shows you that sort of the opportunities are endless in terms of what we can do with that particular link. It is a private sector link ultimately. There are challenges, and I went through it in terms of getting more competition that also works from a French perspective. But we are certainly encouraging all of those conversations from the UK side. We've been speaking to our counterparts to get them to encourage it as well. And it's a great business opportunity for anyone that actually wants to take it. And as I say, there are two parties who are sort of quite deep in exploratory talks about how they can add to the network as well. And I very much want them to succeed.
Very good. Jack, did you have any further?
Well, I think one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is about that interconnectivity as well, because I think that is where we really need to do more to have that multimodal interconnectivity, whether it's rail, whether it's air travel, whether it is some of the other more local transport. We do need to have much better interconnectivity between modes, and not just when it comes to passenger services either. Actually, some of that freight needs to have much better interconnectivity, because at the moment, a lot of the rail freight in this country is not is actually the bulky freight. It's containerised freight. Most of the freight in the UK is not containerised. Only about 10% is containerised. If we want to attract more of that wider freight, some of the parcels and things like that, the Amazons, all that sort of stuff onto the rail network, we need to change the approach a bit to make it easier for that sort of freight to come onto the rail network and to get more of that off our roads. So I think very much the interconnectivity between modes is absolutely essential if we're going to see more usage of our rail network in the future.
Very good. And I'm conscious that I'm sure we'll have many a question potentially from the audience, but we've talked a lot about the sort of practical angles of the railways, but I'm unashamed to say that Conservative Home, you may have guessed, is indeed a political website. So before we hand over to the audience, I would like to ask a political question. And I think I'll start with Hugh. I remember in 2019, ahead of the election, there was a lot of sort of highfalutin talk in Conservative circles about our ambitions for the railways, not least things like reversing the beaching cuts and the like. Obviously, COVID has rather put a spanner in the works of most of the ambitions the government has had over the last 3 or 4 years. But would you say that the Conservative Party remains optimistic, enthusiastic, and indeed ambitious about the future of our railways?
Well, yes, I do. And so if you look at the beaching reversals, so the Restoring Your Railway manifesto commitment back in 2019 saw us commit to £500 million to reverse some of the beaching cuts. And we are building or rebuilding a line right now. It's happening right now, the Northumberland line. And that's taking a sort of good chunk of the budget in order for us to deliver more to the area in the northeast. It also really needs it from a regeneration perspective. And then that becomes a real catalyst for more housing, more businesses, and that's where the railway can be a real enabler of growth. So that commitment is being delivered upon. And then if you also take the integrated rail plans, that's £96 billion plan to deliver better for the Midlands and the North. Again, the work from that in terms of the Trans-Pennine route upgrade, which will see us spend government money from £9 to £11 billion, more than we actually contributed on Crossrail. And that's just an enabler to actually then build better connections, newer connections across the North. And so with that regard, I believe that we are meeting the ambitions. It's also fair to say when we put those out, that was before COVID. Jack mentioned the point about the railways revenues being down by 70%. Southeastern, that uses HS1, their annual season tickets are down by down to a third of what they used to be. You can imagine what that does to the whole. So the very fact that we are spending all of this money, despite the fact that we're now subsidising passenger services, which we never used to do, we actually used to make money out of franchising at one particular point, demonstrates the commitment, not just from the government, but ultimately from the taxpayers who funds this.
Very good. So we've had a ministerial view. Can I ask for a backbench from Jack?
Well, I think in terms of that investment, we do need to see, more of those projects, because that is, and obviously the Restoring Your Railways budget is only 500 million. We've got huge numbers of appetite across the country. It was a very popular programme. We've seen some fantastic schemes come forward, some in my own constituency, to reopen a station at Mere in my own constituency. We need to see more of those sorts of schemes being delivered. We haven't mentioned, the elephant in the room, which obviously is HS2 and Phase 2. But actually, what my belief is, and you'll have seen my views on this, is that actually by freeing up that 28 billion from Phase 2, we can reinvest that money actually in schemes that will genuinely deliver the levelling up in the Midlands in the North. There are so many schemes that we could deliver with that money, which would make a far bigger contribution, make a far bigger impact to actually delivering on levelling up in the Midlands and in the North. And I think that is where we should be focusing and continuing to deliver on the things that matter to people in those communities.
Thank you. And on the particular subject of the railway that must not be named, Jack actually wrote a very good article for us on it a week or so ago, so I can urge you to go in that direction. But anyway, I think it's about time that we had some questions from the audience. So, usual shtick, we've got 2 microphones going around. And so I will ask two people to give questions. Once if there's a particular panellist you want to answer the question, make them aware. And when I am asking for questions, I am very clearly asking for questions and not monologues. So please could we try and I have no qualms about saying sir or madam, please can we get to the point, because we want to get through as many questions as possible, hence why I should probably shut up again. But anyway, so can we have the first couple of questions, this gentleman here and this gentleman here.
Yes, I live in the largest English town that isn't connected by rail, and a reversal of the beaching cuts, it's Lee. Hugh. We need a station in Lee. If I was to get here in Manchester, 10 miles away, I'd have to cross 2 towns to get to a station or catch a bus. So the multimodal thing is something I'm interested in as well. But it's just a point really to say that the reversal of the beaching cuts, and I'm very pleased to hear what Jack said, because that's where the HS2, let's say, reappropriation can be. We just need to see that hugely accelerated, because to say we're doing a line in Northumberland, great for Northumberland, but it's not even a drop in the ocean.
Exactly.
Hugh and Jack, can I look for your thoughts on that? But first, can we have the other gentleman's question?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say, again, post-COVID, is that when we look at the reversal business case, then a lot of them will actually need an operating subsidy. So we're going to end up increasing the subsidies, because some of them could be, that will need a £2 million a year subsidy, and it just keeps adding on to the challenges we have. So we look very closely at the business cases for them, because they are going to have to stack up, and we need to make sure that people will be using them. I do take the point that actually a lot of business cases before haven't revealed the true positives, and actually if you look at it was sort of more of a reopening. It was an old freight line between Oakhampton and Exeter, and that's actually had 4 times the number of passengers that were estimated. So I do take the point that the business case only takes you so far, but we do have to have some evidence base before confirming. Oh, and all I'd say is just there are more announcements that will be coming through in terms of railway projects. So you'll have to see if your preferred one is on there. And also the railway is expensive, so my job is to actually make sure that we deliver it to much better cost and budget and indeed timelines than is going on right now, and it's something that, as my officials know, I have a real passion for and get very frustrated. So if a Northumberland project goes up in value, as I tell all the contractors there and other people that are in the room, then actually you've just stopped someone else's dream from happening. It's not good enough. So there's going to be a lot more of that going on as well.
Very good. And Jack?
Well, yeah, I mean, I very much share what the gentleman said over there about, communities up and down the north, up and around the Midlands, which are not properly connected at the moment, have lost services because of, many of those beaching cuts which stripped out much of the network. So, we really do need to invest in those projects that will make a massive difference to people's everyday lives, and that local transport, that regional transport will make a huge difference. And I think the problem we've had, and I do get what Hugh's saying about the value for money aspect of it, but a lot of the mechanisms of which we assess and Treasury assess these schemes, in my view, is flawed, because you would end up, if you followed everything that was set up in the Treasury Red Book approach to analysing BCR and value for money, you would never build anything outside of London, basically, because everything outside of London ends up being low value for money. So, we need to have an approach which actually focuses on those wider strategic aims, the levelling up, the fact that actually the growth potential of these communities is so much greater. And as Hugh said, where we actually have been brave and taken those steps and invested in some of these schemes, they've proven to wash their face. They've proven to actually attract way more people to use the railway than ever was envisaged through a business case. So actually, I think we need to change some of the fundamentals of how we actually invest in infrastructure in this country, so that that money does go to those communities in the Midlands, in the North, and not just all gets focused on those areas that already have very advanced and developed transport systems like in London.
Thank you, Jack. I've always wanted to have a dartboard with Dr. Beeching's face on it, so maybe I should add 11 Downing Street to it as well. Anyway, can we have the question from the gentleman over there?
Many years ago, Gordon Pettit, you may have heard the name, former Southern Region General Manager, very long-headed, forward-looking type, was of the view that what you now have as HS1 and was then just a distant vision of Channel Tunnel would only ever really come into show its benefits when it connected directly from the cities of the North and the Midlands straight through the Channel Tunnel to cities in Europe, not involving getting lost in London. Would that be a long-term aspiration?
Diane?
Thought that one was coming to me. So, I mean, as you know, it was a long-term aspiration, and the original Eurostar timetable was, certainly based on that, where, the original kind of gauge clearance was done all the way up to Edinburgh, and various other sort of cities. Those plans, ideals were abandoned some time ago, primarily because of, the business case and, demand, and the focus was very much then just on the single leg from London down. I get asked quite often, will there ever be linked to HS2? And my stock answer is not in my lifetime. And I think we have to focus on what we have, not what we haven't got. And as I said earlier on, I've got an asset that's only 50% utilised. We'd like to use it more, please.
That doesn't sound overly optimistic for anybody in Edinburgh who wants to get to Disneyland Paris a bit quicker, but hopefully we can have a bit more ambition on this front. Anyway, another round of questions, please. Can we have the gentleman on this side over here and the gentleman in the third row over there? Yes, sir. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Martin Wright, probably one of the older members in the room, and I can remember when the Channel Tunnel was cancelled by Howard Wilson, and even as a small boy I consider that as a disaster, in the same way if HS2 gets cancelled it's a disaster. Can the panel give me some insight on how a re-engineered HS2 at 300 kilometres an hour as opposed to an over-engineered HS2 at 400 kilometres an hour, how could that become a public-private sector railway in the same way as we've got HS1 connecting with the Channel Tunnel private sector, and you've only got to look at how Kent was dying on its feet before HS1 came, and if you want an example of levelling up, you've got a perfect example. Go to Margate, go to Ramsgate, go to all these places, look at Canterbury University, how vibrant that has become as a rest of it, and how introducing this blood changes the game. So question is, how do you do it public, private, rather than throwing it away as Howard Wilson did, and then eventually you catch up decades later? Thank you.
Can I ask Hugh to perhaps take on the first part of that question? Though I would urge, ladies and gentlemen, we are very much focused on HS1 here today, and whatever might be on the covers of every national newspaper available at all good retailers. But could you also have, Diane, please, would you talk about the impact, actually, that HS1 has had on Kent, the gentleman spoke about? But before we have those responses, just to give you a little bit of time to think, could we have the other gentleman's question, please?
Yes, Minister, it's been great to hear you talk about encouraging private investment into the railway at conference. My name is Sam from Heathrow, and I know you're aware of the proposal for a Southern Rail link to Heathrow. One of the things that has concerned us recently is the Office Rail and Road have proposed a new open access operators charge running to airports, and it would be £5 per train mile, which would not only undermine the profitability of Heathrow Express, but having talked to investors, we're seriously concerned about the commercial viability of future rail links, both at Heathrow and around the country. So my plea, my ask to you is, are you able to ask the OOR to reconsider that charge?
I think that was very specifically at you, Hugh. So,
Great question.
If you'd like to take that and then respond to the other gentleman's question.
Yeah, I will. And actually, that's the interesting part, because I think when you look at open access, where we encourage train operators to come and sort of share the market, and it works very successfully on the East Coast, and of course on HS1, then people just assume it's sort of the Department for Transport that does the sign-off. In fact, it's the Office of Rail and Road. I've met with the Office of Rail and Road and told them how positive I am about open access. I think it's fair to say that in the past, they've always expected the department not to be positive because it crowds out the revenue that, as Jack points out, now comes back to government. My view is actually you increase revenues by getting more people on the entire train network, and actually I would like to see that model expanded. So yes, I did meet recently with Baroness Valentine, the team, who are interested in that particular, effectively doing similar to HS1. They basically build the train line, and then they would actually track access charge to those that would use it. Feels like it's almost there from a sort of self-funding perspective, but perhaps more needs to be done. I will take that away. It's a very good point. I share your interest in it. So thank you for raising it. On the other point there, so look, I think I've sort of been well documented in terms of actually the only way I can actually deal with this, which is there is speculation out there. It's in all the newspapers. Nothing has been announced. Once it is announced, if it is announced, we don't know what will be announced. But my job as the Rail and HS2 Minister is to actually deal with matters and then make them work, and that's exactly what I will do. But I think as the Prime Minister said this morning, no decision has been made, so therefore it's impossible for me to comment on it.
Very good. Diane, your thoughts on the impact that HS1 has had?
Well, I've mentioned quite a few already during the course of the day, but yes, significant impact on a part of the country that, was very down at hill, North Kent, and those benefits continue to come through. I think one thing to kind of mention is that growth doesn't just happen on its own. It's not a case of build it and, they will come. You have to kind of work collaboratively across a number of multi-agencies. HS1 has got a number of kind of quite complicated relationships with development companies, the Ebbsfleet Development Company, for example, the Stratford Legacy team from the Olympics. And various organisations have to work together to drive that growth. And also, more importantly, we've got to work with our main client, which is the government. Because I need to hand an asset back that's in fairly good order in a few years' time. And I think, again, by working in partnership, you can maintain that long-term value and maintain the growth that's there. But you've got to be prepared to put ideas forward. You've got to be prepared to fail sometimes. But, more importantly, you've got to take that long-term view. And, from my perspective, having a concession to 2040 allows me to take that long-term view and have that strategic conversation, which I think is missing a lot in rail today.
Very good. And Jack, I think you had some thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to sort of explain the HS2 situation, which you obviously cannot because it's the situation that's developed. But the reality is, and obviously you can read it in the paper that I did for Conhome, was the fact that HS2 revised their SOBC in January 2022 reduced considerably what was going to actually come from Phase 2. So this stripped out a huge swathe of services. And the reason why they've had to do that is because everything now has to squeeze through Crewe. The Goulburn link has gone. So we cannot connect on to the West Coast Main Line further north. The only place that HS2 using Phase 2 services could connect back onto the West Coast Main Line to serve all of those northwest destinations would be at Crewe. And the problem is Crewe is rammed. It's completely full. There is no spare capacity at Crewe. So actually, by building Phase 2, you create a bigger problem at Crewe because there is no spare capacity to put those HS2 services through Crewe. What HS2 were proposing was actually to take out some of the local and regional connectivity at Crewe, which would have removed. So the furthest north you would have been able to get from Crewe, and this is HS2's own figures, as I say, in the 2022 SOBC, the furthest place north you would have been able to get would have been Lancaster. The only stations that would have seen a better service post-Phase 2 than they do today would have been Runcorn and Liverpool. Nearly every other station up and down the line would have seen reduced services. In some cases, they'd have lost services altogether. Edinburgh, for example. Edinburgh would no longer have had a West Coast service. It would have all been on the East Coast post-Phase 2. That is what's proposed by HS2. What I've been saying is that actually, why not let's use that 28 billion that was going to be spent on Phase 2 to actually invest in the existing network, make those upgrades, make the upgrades at Crewe that are needed, which we can't afford if we do Phase 2, so that we can run services off at Handsacre, which is just around Lichfield, run those high-speed services up to all those destinations and get high-speed services to all those destinations, Manchester, Liverpool and everywhere else, much cheaper, much sooner, and with a similar journey time saving. And that's what we can achieve with the Phase 1 Plus proposals, which we've been putting forwards.
Splendid. It does sound like that particular project is cruising for a bruising, but I hope that's the last question that we have on it today. But on which note can we have another round of questions, please? I think the gentleman here at the front has been very patient. Does anybody else have any questions for the time being? Just the gentleman at the front there.
Mike Newton, Conservative Home Contributor. I just wanted to ask a question about heritage, which I'm sure will be a welcome digression for Hugh in particular. But it's a very important issue, and I think it's also a political issue for us as Conservatives, given the role that many heritage railways play at the heart of community. I was the chairman, until quite recently, of one of the heritage railways in the East Midlands, and my question would be, the regulatory burden through the ORR is very, very high, and given the changes that have happened post-COVID, with shifts in leisure, with older people not coming into heritage railways to volunteer like they used to, a lot of which can be traced back to the regulatory burden. Is there any prospect, Minister, that, I know your intro is very full at the moment, but is there any prospect at some point that the burden on heritage railways could be lifted?
You?
Great question. I have a heritage railway that runs through my constituency. It's a great tourist attraction which brings in money, and actually we're about to extend, I say we, they, are about to extend it onto the main line. And I spoke up for them when I could, when we had the Transport Works Act. And so I'm really pleased that. So it's an example of expansion. It's actually a policy area that's owned by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. But the rail side actually really does need us to lean in more. So just a couple of weeks ago, I had the all-party parliamentary group down on my heritage line, the heritage line, I don't own it, to actually talk about some of the challenges, and I'm actually taking those away to actually work with them and help them to make things easier. So I share the same passion as you. And the other thing that's obviously hit them is not just the drop of volunteers, but the inability to access coal. A lot of it used to come from Russia, and now it's being imported in from South America. It's a fair challenge to raise that we actually have that coal that's available in South Wales, but there's no licence for it. So if we're using the coal and actually bringing it in with its carbon footprint from South America, then why don't we actually use what we actually have under our own feet? So that's something else I'm taking up with them as well. Cost has gone up about fourfold. It's really hard.
Yeah, Jack, do you have any further thoughts on the heritage?
Well, I very much do support our heritage railways, and I think they make a huge contribution actually to the tourism offer, particularly within this country, and the enjoyment, the leisure activities that they do facilitate. So, you know, I don't think I've got anything more to add than what Hugh's added, to be honest, but I think we do need to do as much as we can to support those heritage rail lines and encourage those volunteers who work for them to do more to support that sector.
I can say from a personal perspective, I love a heritage railway, but then I am the sort of nerd who sort of weeps at dishuesrailways.co.uk. So there we go.
I love nerds like you.
It's a fascinating insight into the.
I think
into
I'm in
psychology.
that category as well, actually.
Very sound. Anyway, do we have any more questions for the panel?
All the questions have been from men.
Yes, I don't know. It's just sort of fortunate. Well, I think then a sort of final thing that we should really be asking is about innovation, because we've talked a lot about the productivity challenges and the challenge of growth that the railway has. And I just wondered, Diane, if there's any particular lessons on innovation that you think we should take from HS1, and both Hugh and Jack, if there are anything that you've seen in other lines across the country that you think are examples of best practice that we could see implemented more widely. But Diane, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot insofar as, you know, what the leadership team does to drive innovation. So first of all, you have to have a safe environment where people are prepared to fail. You don't need a long process, right? I usually put my head in my hands on sort of some of the boards I sit on when, you know, oh, we're going to talk about innovation. Here's the process that people have to follow to innovate. And it's just like, no, that's not what innovation is. So what are some of the successes that we've had on HS1? We looked at some of the challenges that Eurostar were having post-Brexit. So we brought in quite a clever app that does digital queuing. Because those of you that have travelled through St Pancras will know that one of the key constraints we have is terminal capacity. By putting an additional check-in, that really affected our ability to do frictionless travel for our customers through the station. So we turned all of St Pancras into a waiting room and worked with Eurostar to basically send an app notification out. So if you're sat having a cup of coffee in one of our wonderful shops and, you know, or shopping in one of our wonderful outlets, then you could go, oh, I've been called down to the train. Now that's a much, much better experience for, you know, for a customer. And I'm pleased to say that Eurostar are now picking that up and they're going to be implementing it. So what you've got to do is, you know, be prepared to kind of work across the system. Think about the problem that you're trying to solve, not just by a gadget and a widget off of a shelf, but really apply it to your business objectives. But more importantly, create an environment where people are prepared to innovate and they're prepared to fail, and be prepared to fail fast and then recover.
Very good. And Hugh?
Actually, the innovation I'd like to see is around diversity. So, I mean, the figures with regards to male, female in the railway, I think it's about 12%. It's absolutely, Joe's here. Right, okay, got a little better, but terrible. Yeah, and also diversity in terms of youth as well. So we have an ageing workforce, and how do we get younger people in? But the reason why I think that's so important is and it's frustrating when some people just think that's some exercise. It's actually really important because that's where you get innovation from. You get different thought, different people into the market who will think differently. And when I look back at some of the challenges, my time in the Select Committee, I look at the May 2018 timetable, that came about because there was a lack of project management, because it was always the feeling of, well, we're all the railway family, you know, we all think it's going to be okay. Well, actually, there's no way to run the railway. It needs to be done in a more professional manner. And I think if we had wider diversity and more inclusion and more outside expertise and challenging the existing thought process coming into the railways, then we'd end up with a better railway as a result.
Here, and Jack, finally.
Well, I do like the innovation that's been made on Avanti actually with the standard premium service. I do think that is more of that is what we need to see. There needs to be more ticketing options for passengers because at the moment it is very restrictive, and I think doing things like that gives more ability for passengers to have that choice because there needs to be more choice for passengers of what passengers want and need. But I think in terms of that wider innovation piece, the only way we're going to have that is if we do make some of the reforms that are needed. I think, you know, there are some significant reforms that are needed around making it easier to have more competition, to encourage the private sector more to, we talked about earlier on about, you know, the fact that all risk and reward now sits with the government. At the moment, there's no incentive actually for private operators to do any of that. You know, there isn't an incentive to encourage them to think, and a lot are still doing it, but there is no incentive to do so. And often there are hoops to go through to actually get approvals from the DfT to be able to even do any of the things that operators want to do and should be able to do. So, you know, we need to make it easier to enable some of that innovation to come forwards. I do think there is going to have to be changes as well around, and we haven't really touched on some of the issues around terms and conditions, with some of the issues of reform that are needed to modernise working practices as well in the rail sector. But there are things there that do need to happen because we have you know, a rule book that is very, very outdated. It's been around, you will probably know this better than me. How old's the rule book?
I don't actually. I hate it when people say that to me, and I don't know that. 1952.
Something like that. So anyway, it's a very old, yeah. Very old, and has not been updated.
Yeah, it's got bigger
for a very, very long time. And we need to see those modernisation of how the rail sector operates in this country, because otherwise we are going to be behind the curve. We're not going to be able to compete and continue to compete because, you know, if we've got terms in there that still relate back to the days of steam, I don't think that that is necessarily what we need for a modern 21st century railway. So we need to make those changes. We need to have a railway that better reflects the needs of the economy, better reflects the needs of passengers and freight, and is able to deliver on the innovation and the reforms that are needed to ensure that it remains relevant for the future.
a job for GPT, perhaps. And I just think we've got a minute or so left. Diane, can we just have some sort of closing thoughts from you on the panel and what we've discussed today?
Keep faith in rail. We've got a long track record. I think you've heard from the discussion in the last hour or so, the significant contribution that rail can make. It's a fixed asset. It's already here. Invest. We've had a hiccup over the last sort of 3 to 4 years, but it's going to be fundamental, to economic growth in this country. So ignore rail at your peril is my message. And please do travel on HS1. We've got lots of capacity. Thank you.
Well, I must admit, after today's panel, I feel very optimistic about the future of Britain's railways. One could almost say they seem to be steaming ahead. On which note, ladies and gentlemen, can we have a hand for all of our panellists who very kindly give their time up today?
Very kind.
Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, William. Well done. Brilliant.